The temperature outside is minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Not the kind of cold that makes you reach for a jacket. The kind that freezes exposed skin in under 2 minutes. The kind that turns breath into ice before it leaves your mouth. The kind that kills, quietly, completely, without warning. Hypothermia does not announce itself. Your core temperature drops to 95 degrees Fahrenheit and your body begins to shut down. By 86 degrees Fahrenheit, you lose consciousness. Below 82 degrees Fahrenheit, the heart can stop. On the northern plains of North America, a blizzard can drive conditions to this point in hours. Wind pushes ice crystals sideways, horizontal, like needles driven by an invisible hand. There is no tree line to break the assault. Nothing between a human body and the sky except whatever that human has built with their own hands. An unprotected person in those conditions has, at most, 30 to 60 minutes, and yet, Native American families lay down on blizzard nights and slept, not fitfully, not barely, deeply, warmly, with children tucked against them and fires breathing softly in the dark. Not one night, not one winter. For thousands of years, across dozens of nations, across landscapes that ranged from open plains to canyon walls to river plateaus, they did not simply survive winter. They mastered it. Before we go further, if this is the kind of knowledge you want more of, subscribe now. What you are about to learn is not folk wisdom. It is not myth. It is physics, biology, and engineering, refined across more generations than most civilizations have existed. By the end of this, you will understand why the most advanced Arctic sleeping systems on the market today are not innovations. They are rediscoveries, and you will understand something even more surprising, that the most critical piece of this entire system was not made from hide, or stone, or fire. We'll get to that, but first, you need to understand what cold actually does to a body that has stopped moving. Sleep is the most dangerous state a human being can occupy in winter. The moment you close your eyes, your metabolic rate drops. Your muscles go still. Your body is no longer generating heat through movement, only through the slow, quiet chemistry of rest. And in a badly insulated shelter, that is not enough. Heat loss follows a path. Fingers first, then toes, then inward, legs, arms, core. When it reaches the heart begins to slow. Cognition fades, and the person does not wake up. For thousands of years, native peoples across this continent understood this. Not from textbooks, not from laboratories, but from something far more demanding. From watching, from losing, from learning what worked and what killed, and carrying that knowledge forward through every generation that followed. Every parent who lay down beside their children in a winter lodge was answering the same question parents across the modern world still ask. Will my children be warm enough? Will they wake up? The difference is that these parents had spent centuries engineering the answer. And the answer was never a single thing. It was a layered architecture. Shelter, bedding, fire, food, social arrangement. Each element calibrated to the others. Remove one piece and the system weakens. Keep all of it in place, and a family could sleep through a blizzard that would kill an unprotected person before the first hour was gone. We are going to go through every layer, but I'll tell you this now. The piece that will surprise you most is not built from wood or hide. It is not the fire, and it is not the stones. It is something so simple that modern survival culture has almost entirely forgotten it exists. Stay with me. The tipi is one of the most recognized structures in human history. Most people can draw its silhouette from memory. Almost none of them understand what it actually was. It was not a tent. A tent is passive shelter, something you place yourself inside and hope for the best. The tipi, in its winter configuration, was an active thermal system. Every element of it was doing something. Every night, before a family lay down to sleep, the lodge was transformed. The first thing you need to understand is the liner. Hung roughly 6 to 7 feet up from the ground along the interior wall, the liner created a sealed channel of air between itself and the outer hide cover. That channel, sometimes only a few inches wide, was not empty space. It was the insulation, dead air. Air that does not circulate cannot carry heat away from the interior. This is the same principle that makes a down coat warmer than a wool coat of equal thickness. It is the same principle NASA engineers applied to spacecraft insulation, layers of trapped, unmoving air, as a barrier against extreme temperature differentials. The Lakota understood this without a laboratory. They understood it because the alternative was death. That gap alone, based on estimates from historians and thermal engineers working from lodge reconstructions, could raise the interior sleeping temperature by as much as 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. On a night at -40, 15 degrees is not comfort. It is survival. Outside, families pack snow in a careful ring around the base of the teepee. But here is the detail most people miss. The snow was never allowed to touch the hide directly. Contact would wick moisture into the material, beginning the slow rot that destroyed a lodge from the outside in. The gap was deliberate, engineered, maintained night after night across the entire length of winter. Some families went further, stuffing dried prairie grass into the space between the liner and outer cover for additional dead insulation. Others stretched a partial ceiling of hide across the upper interior. Warm air rises. In an unmodified teepee, all of it would climb straight toward the smoke hole and vanish into the night. That partial ceiling interrupted the ascent, trapping a pocket of warmth directly over the sleeping area. The family slept beneath it, the way fish rest beneath the still surface of a winter pond. Above them, warmth. Around them, warmth. The cold was being actively managed while they slept. Before anyone lay down, stones were selected from beside the central hearth. Not any stones, dense ones with high thermal mass, the kind that absorb deep heat and hold it. Placed directly into the coals until they glowed, then removed, wrapped in green hide, and buried beneath the sleeping robes. A stone heated this way could radiate warmth for 4, 5, even 6 hours through the night. They did not fight the cold. They made it irrelevant. Now consider what covered the people sleeping on those stones. Winter robes came exclusively from buffalo killed between November and March, the months when the animals carried their densest coat. A hide taken in summer, no matter how carefully processed, lacked the insulating depth of one taken at peak cold season growth. The animal had already done the work of building the insulation. The hunter's job was to take it at the right moment. The processing that followed was where the engineering became precise, and where most people failed to give credit where it is due. The women who processed these hides were not performing domestic labor. They were engineers working in biological materials, with tolerances that left no room for error. A poorly tanned robe did not mean discomfort. It meant a rigid hide that held its shape instead of draping against the body. And a robe that holds its shape creates air gaps, cold pockets between material and skin. In a blizzard, those cold pockets could kill. Brain tanning, working the hide with the animal's own neural tissue, broke down the fibers until the robe moved with the body. It draped. It sealed. It conformed to every curve of the sleeping person beneath it, closing off every gap through which warmth might escape. The physics of this are identical to what modern sleeping bag designers spend millions trying to achieve with synthetic fills and contoured baffles. Fur always faced inward, toward the skin. Layering 2 robes, an inner calf hide against the body, an outer buffalo robe over the top, created multiple stacked layers of trapped air directly against the sleeping person. The materials are different from what we use today. The physics are identical. The Lakota arrived at this solution without a single synthetic fiber, without a single laboratory, without anything that did not come directly from the land beneath their feet. What took modern industry a century of research and millions in development, these women passed down in an afternoon, hand to hand, generation to generation. What the Lakota and Cheyenne built on the open plains was extraordinary, but it was not unique. Hundreds of miles away, across entirely different landscapes, facing entirely different versions of winter, other peoples had arrived at solutions that were different in form, but identical in principle. This is the part of the story that most people never hear, because it is not the story of one clever culture finding one clever answer. It is the story of a continent of peoples, independently, across thousands of years, converging on the same understanding of how heat behaves, how cold moves, and how a sleeping human body can be protected through the night. That convergence is not coincidence. It is proof. On the plateau, where rivers cut deep valleys into basalt, and winters arrived with wet, heavy cold that settled into the bones differently than the dry plains freeze, families dug down. The pit house was not a compromise. It was not a cave adapted out of desperation. It was a deliberate engineering decision, rooted in a fact the earth itself communicates to anyone willing to listen. Soil does not change temperature quickly. At approximately 3 feet below the frozen surface, the ground maintains a temperature near 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the sky is doing above. That figure has been confirmed by modern geothermal measurements, and it is as true today as it was 2,000 years ago. A family that slept inside the earth was sleeping inside a thermal battery. The walls did not lose heat to convection the way a hide wall would. They absorbed whatever warmth the fire and the bodies and the cooking produced, and released it slowly, steadily, through the night. The pit house was often 6 feet deep, entered through a roof opening by a notched log ladder. Benches of packed earth or timber ran along the walls, raised slightly above the floor. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, settled downward and pooled at the lowest point in the room. Anyone sleeping on the floor slept in the coldest layer of air in the space. The raised benches lifted sleepers entirely above that cold pool, a solution so effective that modern passive house designers use the same principle in floor-level ventilation management. A low deflector wall of stone stood between the entrance tunnel and the fire. Cold air entering from outside crept along the floor, but the deflector caught it, redirected it around the fire rather than across the sleeping area. Without that wall, every draft would sweep directly across the people nearest the hearth. With it, the air moved along a controlled path, feeding the fire while leaving the sleeping space undisturbed. Further north and east, the Mandan and Hidatsa of the northern plains extended this logic into a structure of an entirely different scale. The earth lodge could reach 60 feet across, framed by 4 massive cottonwood center posts, layered with willow branches, prairie grass, packed earth and sod, until the building had effectively disappeared into the landscape. Grass grew on the roof. It has been documented that bison grazed on it. Pause on that for a moment. The lodge had become the landscape. It was not a structure placed against nature. It was a structure absorbed into nature, invisible, insulated, humbled into the earth it was built from. That is not architecture as most people understand it. That is camouflage, thermal engineering, and a philosophy of living within the land rather than upon it, expressed in a single structure. Inside, the thermal mass of that foot of packed earth absorbed heat throughout the day and released it slowly through the night. A modest central hearth was sufficient, because the walls were doing the majority of the thermal work. One fire, as many as 20 people, 12 inches of earth between them and the winter. The cold had, quite literally, no way in. The ancestral Puebloans of the Southwest carried this logic further still, cutting dedicated air shafts into the earth that descended to a stone deflector at the base. Cool air fell through the shaft by gravity, struck the deflector, fed the fire, and heated air rose and exited through the roof. A continuous, self-regulating ventilation cycle that required no adjustment, no management, no one to tend it through the night. A passive system, running itself. While the family slept, 3 peoples, 3 landscapes, 3 different structures, 1 understanding. Heat is not generated and then simply kept. It is managed, directed, captured, slowed, recycled. The shelter is not the thing that keeps you warm. The shelter is the thing that keeps your warmth from leaving. That distinction sounds small. It is not. It is the difference between a structure that requires a roaring fire all night and one that needs almost nothing once the thermal mass is charged. The difference between burning through your fuel supply before January and having enough to last until the snow melts. And yet, we still have not reached the layer of this system that modern survival culture has most completely forgotten. The one that has nothing to do with shelter design or material science. We're getting there. We have talked about shelter. We have talked about bedding. We have talked about fire and stone and earth and the physics of trapped air. Now we reach the layer that modern survival culture has almost entirely forgotten. It is not a material. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be packed into a bag or rated on a scale of -40 to -60. And yet, without it, every other layer of this system weakens. Remove it, and the thermal architecture that kept families alive through blizzard after blizzard begins to fail at its edges. We are going to start with the piece you can eat. The evening meal before a blizzard night was not a light one. It was not a courtesy. It was a calculated biological decision, made by people who understood, without the language of nutritional science, exactly what digestion does to a resting body. Digestion generates heat. A body processing a meal rich in fat and protein runs measurably warmer through the night than a body that went to sleep empty. This is not folklore. It is thermogenesis, the metabolic production of heat through the processing of food, and the food that native peoples of the plains had engineered for this purpose was one of the most calorie-dense foods ever produced by any culture in human history. Pemmican, dried meat, pounded to powder, mixed with rendered buffalo fat and dried berries, compressed into dense cakes. 1 pound contained approximately 3,500 calories, roughly 2 full days of modern recommended caloric intake, in a package the size of a brick. Arctic explorers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries carried it as their primary survival food, and more than one expedition leader documented that nothing else kept their men warm and functional through polar nights. Your body is a stove. Pemmican was the fuel. They understood this long before nutritional science had a word for thermogenesis, and they built it into the evening routine as deliberately as they built the liner into the Tipi wall. A person who had eaten pemmican before sleeping was running a metabolic furnace through the night, generating warmth from the inside while the robes and the earth held it in from the outside. The body itself became a component of the thermal system, not a passive occupant of the shelter, an active heat source within it, and they were not alone in that shelter. 8 to 12 people sleeping in a single lodge is not simply a matter of limited space or social custom. It is a thermal strategy, one so effective that its logic has been independently confirmed by modern cold-weather military research on group bivouac survival. A resting human body generates approximately 80 watts of heat continuously through the night. 10 people sleeping together produce 800 watts, released directly into the shared sleeping environment, sustained from the moment they lie down until the moment they wake. That heat does not escape easily when the shelter is properly sealed. It accumulates. It compounds. The lodge becomes warmer as the night progresses, not colder. The arrangement within the lodge was not random. Elders and young children, those who generate less heat and lose it faster, were positioned at the center, or nearest the fire. Adults took the outer positions, where cold most easily penetrated. Dogs were brought inside on the coldest nights, their bodies pressed against sleeping children through the dark hours. No available heat source was left outside if it could be managed otherwise. Every living body inside that lodge, human and animal, was a contributor to the thermal budget. But here is the piece that stops most people when they truly sit with it. The most sophisticated element of this entire system was not built from wood. It was not stitched from hide. It was not carved from stone or coaxed from fire. It was trust. A family that slept apart, slept cold. A family that slept together, that knew each other's rhythms, that had spent years learning how to share space in the dark, that trusted the person beside them to stay through the night, survived. The thermal system required human proximity, and human proximity, sustained through the vulnerability of sleep, requires something that no material can substitute for. 10,000 years of winter survival, and the final variable was not engineering. It was relationship. Fire management through the night was a discipline in itself, and the goal was never a roaring blaze. A large fire consumes fuel rapidly, overheats the interior, and demands more ventilation, which means more cold air moving through the sleeping space. The goal was a sustained, moderate burn, the minimum necessary to maintain temperature and keep coals alive for the morning. Twisted grass bundles, packed tight and tied at intervals, burned slowly and evenly. Dried buffalo chips burned hotter than most people expect, and were gathered throughout autumn specifically for winter fuel stores, a logistical operation that began months before the first snow fell. The smoke hole flaps at the top of the teepee were adjusted through the night by whoever tended the fire, angled in a crosswind to pull smoke out without admitting cold air, opened wider in still conditions to prevent smoke from pooling inside. Reading the smoke hole was a skill passed from parent to child, the same way reading was passed in other cultures. As essential as knowing which stones to heat, or which robes to layer first. A poorly managed smoke hole filled the interior and drove people out into the blizzard. On the coldest nights, that was not a minor failure. It was potentially fatal. The weight of that responsibility was real, and it was carried by someone every single night of winter. When conditions became extreme, when the blizzard pushed past what the standard configuration could hold, the family adapted in real time. Additional hides were layered over the sleeping area. Bodies were pulled closer together. The fire was built slightly higher and fed more frequently. Snow packing around the base was extended and built higher, adding more insulation to the lower walls where cold most easily penetrated. The response was graduated, each step calibrated to the severity of what the night was demanding. There was no single fixed configuration. There was a range, from mild cold to full blizzard, and the family moved through it fluidly, adjusting the system without abandoning its principles. This is what separates knowledge from wisdom. Knowledge tells you what to do. Wisdom tells you how much. Knowledge builds the tipi. Wisdom reads the wind at midnight and adds one more hide before anyone wakes up cold. They had both. Let us bring all of it together, not as a list, not as a collection of clever techniques assembled from different cultures and different centuries, as what it actually was, a single, continuous, integrated system in which every element supported every other, and the removal of any one piece weakened the whole. The shelter provided thermal mass and wind protection. The liner and packed snow created dead air insulation. The partial ceiling trapped rising warmth before it could escape. The heated stones radiated from below through the night. The robes sealed against the body, layer upon layer, fur inward, warmth compounding. The food stoked the metabolic engine before sleep. The social arrangement turned human bodies into a collective heat source. The fire sustained the system from dusk until dawn. The dogs held warmth against the children, and the person tending the smoke hole read the wind so that none of it collapsed while the family slept. 8 elements, 1 system, 0 margin for error. This is not primitive survival. This is systems thinking, applied to the most fundamental human need, refined across more generations than most modern nations have existed, and executed every single night of every single winter by people who could not afford a single mistake. We live in a time of remarkable technology. Sleeping bags rated to -40, synthetic insulation engineered at the molecular level, GPS beacons, satellite phones, emergency bivouac shelters that weigh less than a pound and unfold in seconds. We have more tools for surviving cold than any people in human history. And yet, a family on the northern plains, 2,000 years ago, with nothing that did not come from the land beneath their feet, built a sleeping system so complete, so thermally precise, so deeply understood, that modern Arctic gear designers, when they trace the physics of what they are building, arrive at the same conclusions. Trapped air, layered insulation, metabolic heat management, collective warmth, thermal mass. These are not new discoveries. They are rediscoveries, with better marketing. The knowledge was always there. It was never lost by the people who held it. It was only invisible to the people who never thought to look. Every grandmother who showed her granddaughter which stones to heat, how long to leave them in the coals, how to wrap them so they would not burn through the hide, she was doing something no university has ever fully replicated. She was transmitting a library, not written down, not stored behind glass, stored in hands, in muscle memory, in the practiced, unhurried movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times and knew, without thinking, exactly how it was supposed to feel. The granddaughter watched. Then she did it herself. Then she taught her own granddaughter. And the library moved forward through time, not on paper, but through the bodies of the people who carried it. That is a form of knowledge preservation that modern civilization has largely abandoned, and largely underestimated. We tend to believe that knowledge is only real when it is written, documented, archived, published. But the knowledge of how to keep a family alive through a blizzard was never written down because it did not need to be. It was in the hands of every woman who had learned it. It was in the instincts of every child who had grown up watching. It was alive because the people who carried it were alive, and they had survived every winter that had ever tried to take that knowledge from them. There is something worth sitting with at the end of all of this. We are living in an age of information. More data, more published knowledge than any civilization before us has ever produced. And yet most people alive today could not keep themselves warm through a single night at -40 degrees. Not because the knowledge does not exist, but because we stopped needing to carry it ourselves. We outsourced it, to buildings, to heating systems, to synthetic materials designed by people we will never meet, for conditions most of us will never face. The people of the northern plains did not have that option, and so they did something we rarely do anymore. They paid attention to the stones, to the wind, to the weight of a robe and the angle of a smoke flap, and the warmth of a body sleeping beside them. They paid attention every night, for thousands of years, until the knowledge became so deep, it was no longer thought. It was instinct. And in the morning, they climbed out into the white world, not as survivors, not as people who had endured the night and barely made it through, as people who had never been afraid of winter to begin with, because winter was not their enemy. It was the condition under which they lived. And they had learned, across 10,000 nights of practice and refinement, and loss and adaptation, exactly how to live within it. The fire had burned, the robes had held, the earth had kept its warmth, and the knowledge moved forward. It always did.